Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of We Talk About Home by Marilynne Robinson. This is the ReBookulousley Good Reads discussion group, currently being interrupted by my cat who's playing with wires. Hey, knock it off. I'm Damon Jensen Heitman, one of the pastors of First Presbyterian Church, and I've left my book at the office, so I don't have Imagine Me Holding It, Home by Marilynne Robinson, and chatting our way through it. So we are kind of, at least I am up to page 300 in the book. Let me see what the thing that just happened in my reading is as Teddy came home, of all people, to come home, and Jack came very close to lying to his dad about believing in God, and then chose not to, and that's kind of where we are. And we've just learned that Bowden has left the house, apparently, to Glory, which she is not excited about. And that's where we are. So I don't know, maybe a good place to start is just kind of just a general ask if anything has jumped out to you from your reading, any lingering questions from any of the past conversations. How are you feeling about home?
Can you guys see me?
Yes.
I cannot see any of you.
Yes, we can see.
No.
We're live.
Huh.
We can see you and we can hear you. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. I can't see you.
Mm.
We're all wearing masks. You cannot see us.
Okay.
I'm joking.
You know who else feels unseen sometimes? Glory.
Yeah.
Good segue, Damon.
Ooh.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now I can see me, but not any of the rest of you. Okay. Let me see if I can join.
Are you on a computer or on your phone?
On the computer.
There are little bars up on I think the top right that suggest whom you can see. One will limit it just to the person who is speaking, and another one will give you everybody.
You have your screen in full view?
What's full view?
I mean, like, are you connected to one monitor or two?
One.
Okay. Yeah, you should be able to go up to the right and click on view and see the view at the top right.
Okay.
Yes.
And you want gallery view if you want to see everybody.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm not getting there. So okay, you guys go on with your discussion and I'll jump in.
Okay.
You might leave the meeting and come back in. It might
Okay,
back up.
I'll try that.
Okay. Well, while Constance plays around with that, anybody want to hop in? What are you noticing? What are you wondering about? What's happy about? What's confusing you? Frustrating you about any of these characters and their choices?
Damon, with the World Series on it, I just happen to think about, when things get a little tense, baseball, like for so many American families, is kind of a neutral ground that people, and of course, back in the time that this novel is set, baseball was the national sport. And what is impressed me so much, particularly in this age of polarization, is in general, how nicely professional athletes treat each other at the end of a game, even a very, very close game. And I just thought that was maybe kind of an interesting thing that the TV set provided for that really kind of is spare or Spartan house in so many ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because the TV is used as a way to pull in some of the lived experience of African Americans in the country at the time. I'm trying, this is set mid 50s. Is that kind of what we think, right?
Eisenhower administration, John Foster Dulles, Adlai Stevenson. World, as one of you pointed out in your soliloquy.
The Montgomery bus boycott.
And Jackie Robinson was playing baseball. Right? His
Yeah.
name doesn't come up though, but there was some awareness of that and the national sport. So it gave a thread for conversation, you know, those bits and pieces that we talk about in 2021 that would say, okay, is that an entry point for having the conversation that Jack might and should have with his dad? And he never really does.
Yeah, Jackie Robinson started playing with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 47.
So he was still a factor. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems to me professional sports in particular are, unlike many places in Europe with soccer, are one of the few places left that, you know, can be kind of neutral ground again, even today.
Yeah, they sometimes can be, but like Bowdoin doesn't really seem to be interested in baseball. Ames is, right? Reverend Ames really enjoys listening to the games and then watching the games, and has that from Gilead. He has that memory of I think his grandpa took him to a game somewhere to watch some particular player. I forget now. Who?
Robbie and Jack.
Yeah, and Robbie and Jack have seemed to have connected over baseball. So that it's interesting to see that connection kind of from Jack's standpoint, because he doesn't seem really all that interested in connecting. He sees Robbie, I think, as a way to get in with Ames. And that doesn't really work out for him, it doesn't seem.
Especially lifting Ames's baseball mitt. I'm sure did not endure him.
And why did he do it? Because it was there. Essentially, because he could.
It, I think, to Robbie, didn't he?
Say again, Denny.
He lent his baseball mitt to Robbie. You know, for in that particular game, in that particular scenario.
Yeah. And he gave him a baseball. But when Jack was a youth, he stole Ames's kind of beloved baseball mitt, and then returned it a couple of days later. Yeah.
I kind of thought that part of Jack's wanting to play catch with Robbie was I think he wanted to try to find a way to be able to talk to Ames, and in some ways playing catch with his son sort of alienated him, but I think he could not. I think he was in some ways trying to make up by playing with that child, when he was, I think, so desperately missing his own son, and knowing that he would probably never play catch with his own son.
Who's missing their son?
Jack.
I didn't know Jack had a son.
You'll find it out very soon.
You know, to me, that's one of the questions so far of the novel. I mean, if we've read the whole thing, or some of Robinson's other writing, we know that Jack has a son, and yet he never says, I mean, in the internal monologues and so forth, there's never a mention of the son, that Jack is missing the son. He never says anything to anybody. And yet you think he'd have to be missing him. And this emptiness in Jack could be partly missing his son. But I think it's a really interesting, to me, it's a puzzle in the novel.
Yeah. And I have to say, I went ahead and finished because I'd read it before, but I wasn't sure where we were supposed to stop. So I just kept going. But I've read the other novels too. And I don't know if anyone else read them, but it seems that in one of the novels, I recall Jack showing a picture, the picture that he carried in his wallet. There's some reference to the picture in his wallet of Della, and I think the son. And it seems to me that he showed that to someone, to Ames, perhaps.
I don't think that's in this novel. Maybe it, but
no, I don't remember it in this novel. But when you read when you read Gilead, then when you read this novel, there are things that, it's the same scene that was in Gilead, but it's from a different perspective.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You
There's
know,
a package. Oops.
now that you say about the picture, half a dozen times in this novel, there are references to Jack that there's some kind of a little leather folding pouch that he puts in his pocket and doesn't let anybody see, and kind of doesn't pretty much let it out of his sight. And that would be a perfectly logical place for wallet-sized pictures.
Sure. It didn't occur to me until just now because I kept wondering, okay, what is this thing he's hiding?
Mm-hmm.
Are we ever going to find out what it is that he's feeling so protective of that he can't even let Glory see it?
Yeah, well, I mean, sorry, Constance, go ahead.
Oh, but he also doesn't tell Glory that she's an African-American woman.
Exactly. No, he does not. Well, he doesn't, and Glory seems to be pretty enlightened for a person of her time about civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the father is pretty obviously hostile
Mm-hmm.
to African Americans, but Glory doesn't seem to be. And yet Jack doesn't tell her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, this is just kind of Jack's way. He doesn't ever tell anybody anything. um, and, or or hardly anything, or what he's really thinking or feeling. He always feels separate from everybody else, and then that kind of becomes just kind of becomes his way. He sets up his little tent in the loft, in the barn / garage, and so he can just have even more, hide even more things, I suppose.
We kind of get a little picture here to something that's been bothering me all along, which is why is Jack, why has he done all these things that alienate people? And he says somewhere in here that he was testing his father to see how far his father's rope would stretch, and that he knew that he had actually, I think he calls it stepping off the ledge, when he has impregnated Annie Wheeler. And then he left school, which was another stepping off the ledge. Does that seem to ring for anybody else?
Mom's leaning in. Lois took herself off mute, so I assume that she might have something to throw in.
Okay.
I don't know if it relates exactly, but the other thing that I thought was interesting about Jack was he made a comment that he wished that he would have, like, when he was a teenager and was stealing things and all that, he makes the comment that he wished he would have stolen things that were explicable, or he could explain why he took them instead of just doing it, which I thought that was kind of interesting. It doesn't mean he didn't want to stop stealing things, but if he would have stole things that made sense to steal, is that what he was saying?
Yeah, I think that relates. I think that Jack himself he seems unable himself to explain his actions.
Right.
And explain
Damon,
why.
I keep coming back to your comment. He does these things because he can.
Mm-hmm.
And he just does.
Yeah, and when he's talking to, he comes close to lying to his dad and telling him that he believes in this in something in scripture, as far as he's willing to try to go. And in the course of that conversation, he says to his dad, I wish that I could have been like you, or if I could have been like you, I would have. But he just can't. I don't know. It's just, yeah, Mom.
Didn't you find it odd though, in the negative feelings that Jack brings out in everyone, the one thing he couldn't do was lie to his father. I found that quite interesting. He couldn't do it.
Right.
And I don't think it was because he had never told a lie, but for some reason he couldn't do that to his father. I found that interesting, I guess.
Yeah, he clearly believes in things, right? He seems to clearly believe in equality and civil rights movement, and and that sort of thing. He just can't believe in God.
And yet I think he wants to.
I don't know. I don't know if yeah, maybe he wants to.
I find it interesting that he knows the Bible so well.
Oh, very well educated and very well read, isn't he?
Yeah. Yeah.
Jack's command of the English language, I think, is extremely impressive.
Oh, man. Yes. Yeah. I'm reading the paragraphs and looking up like every fourth word.
Oh, I quit looking up all the words, I'm sorry. Partly because I was reading on my phone or my laptop, and so then I didn't have, it was too awkward. But
Mhm. Yeah. But I mean, it's because in the course of that conversation, he says, he tells his dad, I've been reading the scripture, and his dad says, he comes here and he tells me that he's been reading scripture. Any fool knows that he's been reading scripture. He knows scripture better than I do. Right. And so, gosh, if he knows scripture that well, he's got to know that he's the prodigal son. Right. And he's got to know that he's the screw up. He's the unrepentant.
yeah, and he also is the one, and I don't know if it's before the 300th page, if it's after, but there was more discussion on the night he was born, and is that in where we've gotten to so far?
So,
And I think that wasn't a new story. It seemed to be familiar to everyone. And I think it must have been repeated often. And I just think that there was a lot of guilt placed by Boughton on probably all of the kids, all of the children. It seems like he was that just seems like that was his philosophy. But I think Jack knew and accepted that he was the one who caused problems from the moment of his birth.
Yeah, Sharon.
I was going to ask too, along that same line, but kind of off the wall in some ways. Is it possible that some people might be addicted to forgiveness? And I say that in the sense that he kind of saw himself as someone who people responded to when he needed grace. And he wasn't quite sure why he was always doing the kinds of things like stealing the mitt or whatever else. But I think he understood fully the value of grace and forgiveness, because it always seemed like he was in that cycle of guilt. So I kind of wondered if he got not comfortable, but familiar with the idea of being forgiven. And if anybody's ever heard of anybody like that.
Well, I think this is in one of the half memories of the Annie Wheeler escapade isn't quite the right word, but that I think it's a conversation that he has with Glory, and he says, well, what do you think Dad's gonna do? And he says, Dad, he's not, to me, nothing. He's gonna, I think Constance, you've pointed this out in the past, right? Like, to me, nothing. He's gonna forgive me.
Yeah, and it's it's a familiar feeling for him. He doesn't quite know how to be on the other side of it.
right.
Praise.
But he's only, what, 20 when he says that? It's
Something like
from
that.
a long time ago,
But he keeps drinking, right? I mean, there are things about his drinking that cause him to sort of want to get out of some kind of rut he's in, but he can't quite do that. And I just thought I'd throw that out there. Whatever it's worth. Because he seems to be in that pattern all along. More comfortable than actually staying in the church or actually telling his dad something and being given a little credit for doing it. He'd rather kind of be in the pattern of, well, do what you usually do and forgive me and give me grace.
To me, Jack is not only a random molecule of gas in a cylinder, but help me here. Jack may be the only one of the 8 children who spent 20 years in St. Louis, a very, very urban subculture, and absorbed a huge amount of enemy and, with the African American community, that in some way or another may have him question, Gilead as a place of value of who would want to live there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Go ahead, Mom.
and yet he seemed to ponder whether, he asked a couple of times if, I think he asked Glory if she thought, or if whoever thought it would be a place to settle down and raise a family. So
Yeah, he needs a place that is safe. He needs a place where somebody is gonna help him stay clean, right? If he has any hope of being reunited with Della and I guess his son, he needs a place. He needs some safe place to bring them, but to your question, Denny, all of the kids seem to question the concept of Gilead. It's interesting. We in the book about Ames and Lila and Robbie, Gilead was kind of this ideal sort of place, it seemed, for everybody. It was this wonderful spot of healing and togetherness and all that sort of good stuff. And it seems not to be the case here. That'd be the cat doing things she shouldn't do. When Glory finds out that she's going to inherit the house, she's mortified. It's a nightmare, she says.
Mhm.
This is the nightmare that I knew was going to happen. Yeah.
Which is also
And-
interestingly, because she says that's the nightmare, and then Jack talks about his nightmare of, well, she wants everybody to come back and find her, and he wants people to look in the barn and find him, or used to when he was a child, as the recurring nightmare. And so they both seem to want not to be abandoned.
Mhm.
and Jack, even, I think he knew how Glory felt about the house. And, he offered to move stuff around so she could stash more stuff in the attic that she didn't want to look at.
Mhm.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, where she wants to get out from under the house and he wants to help organize it so that she can more of the stuff that she doesn't want. Just that was really, really bizarre. And speaking of that, on page 299, when we kind of get into her consciousness, there's just a wonderful paragraph where she describes, that kind of condenses, and I hope it's okay if I just read it quickly. Again, this is starts out about a fourth of the way down the page. but he kept looking around at the table and the sideboard with the leonine legs and belligerently clawed feet, like some ill-considered doily-infested species of which they were the last survivors. The wall sconces that were lotus blossoms with light bulbs where their stamens ought to have been. She thought, dear Lord, he is missing it all in anticipation. She thought, as long as he is alive in the world, or as long as no one knows otherwise, I will probably have to keep all that sour, fierce, dreary black walnut, that purple rug. And if he dies, I will still have to keep it because I have seen him look at it this way. But I mean, I fell in love with that expressly infested. And particularly because I had a great aunt and uncle that this could have been their house. And they were just a slave to the place. You know, all they ever did was, you know, my uncle spent his summers cutting the grass, and, you know, my aunt just, you know, kind of stayed inside and worried about everything. And I kind of see this same pattern here.
Yeah, I'm as we're talking, I'm thinking about the story of the prodigal son, or you could call it the story of the merciful father, or you could call it the story of the jealous brother, right? and I've read that story a lot of times and thought about that story a lot of times, but I've never thought really about what drove the prodigal son out of the house, right? It's generally just kind of assumed, well, the prodigal son was kind of a jerk, and that's why and that's why he asked for his inheritance early, and that's why he ran from his obligations at home. But you know, we're talking about the house and the kind of the system that they grew up in, and there's ways that like the things that we grow up in nurture us and sustain us, and they prepare us to move out into the world. And you know, and sometimes we experience some parts of those things as somewhat confining, or there's some part of it that we feel the need to re-question and reassess, and all those sorts of things. Yeah, and so I'm wondering about, I don't know, what drove him out of the house, right? What drove the prodigal son out of the house, and also compelled him to try to come back at some point. But so that was kind of a half thought.
All the kids, all the Boughton offspring feel that they have to come home, but they can't wait to get out of it.
Mhm.
They can't wait to leave home.
Yeah. And Boughton himself seems to know that and acknowledge it. I think he says that at one point. Because they all call this place home, but they show up and they can't wait to leave.
Right.
A little further past, oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say what Anne read about the house. A little further down on that page, Glory comments about she would like to change things, but knows that she can't, because if anybody comes home, they're going to want it to be the same.
Mm-hmm.
So she's kind of stuck there, keeping it the same, even if no one comes home.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I'm kind of that when growing up, when my parents retired, they sold the house that we lived in as kids. And I knew that house was torn down because a farmer bought it. I've never been back down that mile because I know the house is gone. So I just have to remember it the way it was. So I can kind of relate to those kids wanting to come home and seeing it the same, even though it's not necessarily where you want to stay forever. It's home. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that there's something in this work about our connection to the past is sort of both. It's an anchor. It's an anchor, which is sometimes good and helpful, and sometimes not really all that helpful, right? Sometimes the anchor is the thing that you need to keep you steady and in place, and sometimes it's just holding you back. And I think there's something going on in this novel about our connection to the past that it's both of those things, right?
I'm always interested how many Hastings College graduates, go off to, the proverbial big city, graduate school, whatever, and eventually, not up, a surprising number end up coming back, to Hastings, whether in professional capacity or otherwise. And I kind of wonder if that is, somewhat typical of America trying to find that anchor again.
Of course, I think it's one thing if someone makes a choice to go somewhere and to live there, but Glory has said, and I believe her when and I think she's straightforward here, that she hadn't wanted to stay in Gilead, and now she's stuck because she has this house.
Yeah, and Jack says, "Well, you could sell it." But she seems.
He wouldn't have anybody to come home to then. I wondered if that kind of got caught up in this too. That you come home for Boughton until he passes away, basically, because you come home to see Dad if you're one of the others who've been comfortable living away. But these two come back because they're sort of matching themselves up to what their dad expected them to be, or could be, or to help him out. And then when he's not there, Glory might say, "Oh my gosh, I have to stay here for Jack, just in case he comes back ever again and needs a place to be." So that a person might be the bigger anchor than the house, is what I'm thinking.
For those of you that have read, several of Marilynne Robinson's quartet, how much time lapse is there between the first one, Gilead, and the last one, Home? Do you have a feel for that?
Do you mean, Denny, time lapse between the writing of them, or because I think they occur concurrently?
No, that's what
narratives. The narratives are concurrent, I think.
That's what I'm wondering, if it's concurrent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you just.
There are a lot of flashbacks. If particularly in Lila, I mean, her life starts when she's 3, maybe 4. Is kind of basically an abandoned child under the porch.
You mentioned flashbacks, and we get another flashback in this section to Annie Wheeler and to Jack's first child, and I think it's Boughton reveals that at some point in that, Glory slapped Mr. Wheeler. I don't know his name. Go ahead, Constance.
I don't know what his name was, but that sort of came out of nowhere for me. I didn't remember that from anywhere
Yeah,
else.
I didn't either.
Anybody explain that? You know, what that scene?
It seemed to me that that Bowden, I think, was trying to convince that family to let this child come and live with them,
Oh, okay.
because he didn't think that it. But since Jack wouldn't admit to his obligation, then they couldn't do it. And it seemed in the midst of that conversation or confrontation, that then that Gloria slapped Mr. Wheeler, because it was no place to be raising a child, apparently, at least from the Bowden's viewpoint. Though I would assume that Annie had been raised there. Yeah, so I think it was maybe in the midst of that conversation, but I don't know for sure.
Okay. I think I'm
Yeah, I kind of picture, oh, go ahead, please, Constance.
sorry. 294. I never know where Bowden's coming from in all of this. He just comes out with all these horrible things to say to Jack. And see, I thanked God for him for him every day of his life, no matter how much grief, how much sorrow, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, it's like watching a child die in your arms. He's likening that to Jack's life. And he says, which I have done. And is it?
It almost seems in some of these passages that Bowden is becoming disinhibited, as sometimes people do as they get really close to death. And he's kind of in and out of that way of relating to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he definitely seems to have some kind of dementia, you know.
Yeah, and go ahead, Denny.
Well, that that scene, if somebody else could explain that, where they're at the table, you know, around 294, and Bowden simply pretends or does not recognize Jack. You know, you just kind of, excuse me, what happened here all of a sudden? I mean, it's like this guest is in his house, and you're not quite sure who he is.
Yeah, I took that, Denny, to be a dementia episode. Is how I took that. That, you know, that little piece, Constance, that you shared, I think there's like maybe 3 or 4 sort of little, not little things, but things that Bowden mentions there as like sort of his great griefs in life. Jack, and then it seemed like he maybe kind of got forced out of the pulpit before he was really ready to be out of the pulpit, and then also the death of his wife, which I don't know, he seemed to be sharing, I don't know, as a way of saying, hey, life is rough for all of us at times. I don't know. And I'm thinking back to our conversations that we had closer to the start of the novel, and there a lot of frustration that we seem to have with Bowden about essentially not really being honest with Jack and saying, hey, like, you can't do this, this is wrong, and this is why, and that sort of stuff. And here we get some real clear honesty from Bowden, which is interesting.
Well, it's quite different from the way he's ever treated him, you know, until now, so far as we know.
Yeah. We do also in this section, we get another son returns home very briefly, but he returns home. So it's the day, is it, I don't know if it's the same day or the next day after Jack has his suicide attempt. Teddy shows back up.
Right.
Teddy is apparently the conscientious son. He's a doctor. Shows up unannounced. I don't know what people made of that, or if they made anything of that. But
Well, Glory's so frustrated by it because she has, she felt like their relationship has been so good, and she sort of wanted to show this off to somebody, you know, let Teddy know that, hey, I've been really helpful to my brother. And now, you know, she doesn't have that. I mean, in a way, she's relieved to have him there, but also resentful at the timing. And he's the second person that Jack tries to talk to about finding his soul, understanding his soul, and how does he proceed with his father, knowing now as he does that his father is so disappointed in his not being a believer. And I think it's also kind of goes back to something we were talking about a little earlier, that he asks his brother if he would ever bring his kids to Gilead, as if to say, could you raise kids here? Would you ever want to?
mm-hmm.
I also found it interesting that that Teddy and Jack, as different as they are described as looking alike. I mean, you know, we have again these, you know, comparisons and contrasts and, you know, kind of parallel characters. And I thought that was the.
And my impression is that Teddy must be practicing medicine, you know, close somewhere in a larger city, but close enough to Gilead that he just slipped in because he had patients, he had somebody covering for him, and it was just an opportunity that he could get away. Maybe I misread that, but
No, that's the way that I read it, Denny. Yeah. He's somewhere close enough that he could get there in a day and get back in the afternoon and have it not really be a big deal. And yet he doesn't seem to come by all that often.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it odd that he didn't come by all summer while Jack and Glory were gardening and everything? He doesn't show up. None of them show up the entire, and it seemed to me it was a summer. And yet the day after Jack tries to kill himself in the car, here's Teddy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he says something about like there's polio concern, and so during the summer they send the kids someplace else, and right, and somebody says, well, like, couldn't you bring him here? Like, this also seems pretty, not a lot of people around here, but yeah, but they don't.
But he didn't vaccinate them. Wasn't the vaccine out then?
No.
Well, he said he tells somebody that they should wait until they've improved it a little bit.
yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I had the impression though that they had sent the kids to Teddy's wife's parents. So there's a kind of logic to that. I mean, who would they send them to in Gilead, to watch them? I don't, Bowden couldn't handle taking care of, young kids.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. But they don't ever seem to like stop by for the weekend or anything.
Yeah.
No, they sure don't.
And didn't Teddy also ask Glory, wasn't he having some, what I thought might be like rheumatoid arthritis or something that apparently the father, that's part of he has so much pain all the time, and Jack picked him up and carried him because he was in so much pain. But it seemed that Teddy, wasn't it Glory he asked if she was having any symptoms, because he was apparently starting to feel it in his hands, and for a doctor, ooh, that would be maybe the end of his career.
Yeah, I think he asks both Glory and Jack if they have any symptoms of arthritis. And they don't so far.
Okay, and I may have misread the passage, but I thought that Teddy also picked up his father and carried him,
That could be.
which would be a parallel, because that's something that Jack has also done.
Mhm. What about the scene when Bowden asks both boys to stand next to one another and he wants to see them and remember them together? What did anybody make of that?
Yeah, I thought about, I think Constance, you've brought this up before about the different ways that they all remember their growing up years and what the house was like in their growing up years, and that Bowden perhaps has a more idealized version of that in his mind than his children do. And I read that there was something of that desire to sort of have things the way they used to be in that, or how Bowden remembers them being. Go ahead, Denny.
Lois and I were visiting this afternoon about Jack's botched suicide attempt, and he didn't have any street smarts. Anybody that knew anything about cars would not stuff a part of his shirt, a sleeve, and a couple of socks in an exhaust pipe without shutting the door and expect to die of carbon monoxide. And I even looked it up today because I thought, man, back in the day when I was 15 and some of my buddies were stuffing potatoes, jamming potatoes onto exhaust pipes, what happens is the car dies immediately because it's a circulation system. And he didn't have a clue about that DeSoto. I mean, just enough to get it going, but
Gotta go. He was also pretty drunk at the time.
oh yes.
Yeah.
I almost wonder if he watched that on purpose.
Well, it seemed like it was a rather feeble attempt. And yet.
Yeah, it makes me wonder how many times he's tried it. He reveals, and we're about at the time where we might want to start wrapping up, but he reveals to Glory in this section a little bit more about the depths to which he sank while he's been gone. He says that he was in jail, and then he says when I said earlier that I was in jail, I should have said that I was in prison. I assume prison is more serious than jail. I don't know.
Yeah.
I assume jail is like the overnight, couple of nights sort of thing, or county facility, and the prison is maybe a state facility. So, and Glory says, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me if you were in prison. And Jack doesn't seem really sure if he can believe that or not.
Yeah, doesn't he kind of try to add on to the bad things he's done to, again, kind of test her? Are you going to reject me? And she doesn't ever reject him.
Yeah, I think there's, thinking about this in terms of the prodigal son parable, from the Bible, there's something about, do any of us really feel that we can really trust the grace that the total and undeserved grace that we are offered by God? And if we were to take a real clear, honest sort of look at ourselves, to what extent would we feel that we were redeemable? And to what extent would we feel that this is just, we're just kind of stuck in this, we're in the mud, we're mud people, that's it. That's who we are. So there does seem to be in Jack this, and we talk about it all the time, this essentially, am I redeemable, or am I not?
Yeah, and that long porch scene, which I finally went back and reread, but we had talked about that last time. At the end of the conversation, when Lila says, I think people can change, everything can change. And he says, thank you, that's what I wanted to know. So they'd had that really long conversation, and then she gives that simple explanation, and that was what he wanted to hear.
Yeah. And it just occurs to me that he may be thinking about himself. He may be thinking about Della's father in that question as well. Like, can a person change to be accepting of someone or not?
One of the things that struck me reading this novel and her others is, it seems to me this could be made into a wonderful stage play, could be adapted, just because it's such a narrow setting. And, there's so much focus on rich dialogue.
And there's so many little details that you don't pick up on until they're mentioned later.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we're getting ready to close, but one thing that struck me, and if you haven't finished the book, it may come back to you later, but when Jack asked her to clean out the barn and clean out everything he had up there in his little hideaway. There was a bottle, and there was a glass, and there were a flashlight and whatever, and there was a framed picture of a river.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes up later.
Right.
And it's somehow or other, Jack he feels tied to this place, to the river, to Gilead, to home.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, even though he doesn't ever fit in, feels like he doesn't belong, he still holds on to it.
Yeah, that picture is meaningful to him. he put it in his room as soon as he came home.
Mhm. And there it was up in his little hideaway,
Anyway,
then it
we'll
will
see it.
shows up again.
Right.
And I hadn't even, really thought much about it. He just had this, he said it in his room. But things keep coming back in her novels.
Mhm.
Has everybody here finished the book?
Nope, not me.
Okay, Denny. It's Denny and I holding everybody back.
Well, will we have a final discussion of the end? It's
Oh,
not
we can.
the way.
That would be very nice.
Yeah.
So we are scheduled to have one of our recorded conversations next week that Anne and Constance and Jenny and myself will do. We're scheduled to have one of those on Thursday morning and post that. But we could have an all group conversation if we wanted to as well. We could have it that next Thursday evening. I think that would work for me. Or we could stay on our every other week schedule as well. I'm game for kind of whatever folks are thinking.
I would say every other, I would say that let's skip, a week. So we have time to listen to Constance and Anne and Jenny.
Okay. So that would be then Thursday, November 11th. So yeah, we can certainly do that. I'm happy to host and have that conversation. I think that'd probably be nice. Yeah.
I have another meeting that night, but I think the chief will be available.
Okay. Does that make sense? That works?
Sure.
Okay. Well, yeah, we'll shoot for the November 11th. We'll go ahead and see what we can do there. So, yeah. So I'll go ahead and kind of draw us to a close. Like I said, next week, Thursday, we'll have one of those recorded conversations and we'll post that onto YouTube. I will try to remember to send you all, an email alert to that as well. And then we'll plan on gathering again in kind of the whole group setting 2 weeks from tonight on in the evening on Thursday, November 11th. So thank you all for your questions, for your reading, for your conversation. Denny, we'll look forward to reading the first few pages of your adaptation for stage. So you can start working on that, and we'll proofread it for you. How does that sound?
Wonderful. Ibsen and I are working on it right now, actually.
Okay, sounds good. Well, keep us in the loop. If you need any feedback, let us know. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
Thanks.
you.
bye.
Oh.